What if I told you you're not as immune to cults as you think? When most of us hear the word cult, we picture something extreme, remote compounds, strange rituals, maybe people in matching outfits, cut off from society. It feels distant, obvious, easy to avoid. But what if that picture is misleading? Because the reality is, cult dynamics don't always look dramatic. They can show up in self-help movements, wellness communities, high-control workplaces, online groups, even social circles. Not all of these are cults, but some operate using the same psychological playbook. And that's what this episode is about. Not just those people, but the systems of influence that could affect any of us. So you may be asking, what is a cult? There's no single agreed upon definition, but researcher Stephen Hassan describes it as a group that uses deceptive recruitment and coercive control to gain power over individuals. That phrase, coercive control, is important because we're not just talking about belief, we're talking about influence over behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. Most cults share a few traits though. Charismatic leader, an us versus them worldview, suppression of doubt, and a gradual reshaping of identity. That last part matters most because cults don't just tell you what to believe. They slowly change how you see yourself and reality itself. Often this centers on something called the cult personality. That's when a leader becomes more than a guide. They become the authority. Their ideas aren't just influential, they're treated as truth. Sometimes they're seen as morally superior, uniquely gifted, even divine. And at that point, questioning them doesn't just feel wrong, it feels dangerous. So how does this actually happen? Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton studied thought reform, what many call brainwashing. He identified 8 patterns that show up in high control groups. They are milieu control, mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over person, and dispensing of existence. So, let's go through each of these. The first one is milieu control, which is controlling information and environment. Those in leadership tightly regulate the flow of information, what members see, hear, and discuss, as well as how it's delivered. Over time, this creates a kind of isolation from outside perspectives. Members are encouraged to trust only group-approved sources, while everything else is dismissed as false or misleading. Eventually, this control becomes internalized, and individuals begin monitoring and censoring their own thoughts. The second is mystical manipulation, which frames events as meaningful or destined. Experiences within the group are often carefully orchestrated, but presents as if they are spontaneous or even supernatural. Leaders may use prior knowledge or staged situations to create illusion of special insight or divine influence. To members, these moments can feel like proof that something extraordinary or otherworldly is happening. The third is a demand for purity, which divides the world into good and evil. The world is framed in extreme all or nothing terms. Good versus evil, right versus wrong. Members are expected to meet unrealistically high standards, leaving little room for nuance or human imperfection. This often leads to cycles of guilt and shame, where individuals constantly feel they're failing and must try harder to measure up. The fourth is confession, which encourages personal disclosure. Personal privacy is gradually eroded. Members are expected to disclose thoughts, emotions, and past actions that don't align with the group's expectations. These admissions may be shared publicly or with authority figures. Rather than being released, this information can later be used to influence, pressure, or control the individual. The fifth one is sacred science, where doctrine is absolute truth. The group's belief system is treated as unquestionable truth. morally, intellectually, and sometimes even scientifically. Doubt or disagreement isn't tolerated. Leaders are often elevated to a status where they're seen as beyond criticism, sometimes even as having a special connection to a higher authority. The sixth is loading the language, which simplifies ideas into catchphrases. The group develops its own specialized vocabulary, simplified phrases or slogans that reduce complex ideas into rigid black and white terms. This kind of language shapes how members think, often shutting down critical reflection and reinforcing the group's worldview. The seventh one is doctrine over person, where belief overrides experience. Personal experiences, instincts, and moral judgments are considered less valid than the group's teachings. If someone feels conflicted or questions the ideology, the issue is framed as a flaw with the individual, not the belief system. The doctrine always takes priority over personal reality. The eighth and the final one is dispensing of existence, where outsiders are lesser or wrong. The group determines who is worthy or valid, often implying that only members truly matter. Those who leave, criticize, or exist outside the group may be dismissed as inferior, misguided, or even undeserving. In extreme cases, this mindset can justify serious harm against others. There's a lot that takes place. The thing is, none of this happens all at once. It's gradual. And while you're inside it, it feels normal, like it's supposed to happen that way. Going even a step further, an Army psychologist, Margaret Singer, wrote a book called Cults in Our Midst with cult expert Janie Lalick, identifying 6 conditions for exerting undue influence on a person. Think of Lipton's 8 patterns as the mechanisms of thought reform, and these 6 conditions as the implementation. So the first one, you're kept unaware of what is happening and how you are being changed one step at a time. The second one, your social and or physical environments are controlled. The third one, they systematically create a sense of personal powerlessness and dependency is created. Number 4, your old identity is broken down by a system of rewards, punishments, and experiences that inhibits any behavior that might reflect your formal social self. Number 5, a new belief system is installed through a system of rewards, punishments, and experiences that promotes learning the group's ideology or belief system and group-approved behaviors. And number 6, this new identity is reinforced through a closed system of logic, an authoritarian structure that permits no feedback and cannot be modified except by the leaders. No force is required, just influence, repetition, emotional pressure, and just a little bit of time. So, an example might be helpful to see how this plays out. Let's look at Synanon. Synanon began in the 1950s as a drug rehab program founded by Charles Diedrich. At first, it was groundbreaking, offering structure and community when little else existed. One of its core practices was called the game. It was a group session where people intensely confronted each other, sometimes harshly, even humiliatingly, all in the name of growth. And for some, it worked. But over time, things shifted. Control increased, isolation grew, leadership became authoritarian. Eventually, Synanon became something far more extreme. Between 1966 and 1967, Synanon shifted its highly praised rehab program into what is now known today as a cult. The graduation from the program was no longer an option for fear that individuals might relapse. Couples were now separated and children were raised communally, with infants living in what was called the hatchery. Despite all this, throughout the 1970s, juvenile agencies and the California court system continued to send teenagers labeled juvenile delinquents to Synanon's Malibu re-education camp. When members started to flee the cult, a citizen named Alvin Gambanini, a neighboring rancher to one of the Synanon facilities, sheltered many who had managed to escape. In retaliation, cult members beat Gambanini in front of his family. With 1,300 members and more than 30 million in assets, Synanon sought religious status in 1974. It was the largest property owner in Santa Monica and had a chain of gas stations and their own airstrip. Nonviolence was abandoned, and they created Imperial Marines to maintain order on campus. For nearly 25 years, the program was nationally lauded for its allegedly successful treatment program until the public turned against Synanon in 1978. That was when its supporters put a 4-foot rattlesnake in the mailbox of Paul Morantz, a California attorney and investigative reporter who had been pushing for investigations into Synanon. And here's the uncomfortable part. Some of its methods influence modern approaches, forms of tough love, approach of scaring or shaming individuals into rehabilitation still exist today. Former members of Synanon went on to create new rehab facilities, applying those aspects of Synanon into their models, as well as pre-established facilities adopting parts of Synanon's approach. Some examples of these facilities are the Elon School in Maine, Daytop Village, Topic House, Phoenix House, Harmony House, Odyssey House, all the houses, Gateway, and CEDU Educational Services. CEDU, like many of these other facilities, were purchased by private equity firms like Universal Health Services, which own multiple teen rehabilitation centers even today. Despite reports like these, there remain rehabilitation organizations which have continued to use the tough love methodologies created by Synanon to allegedly cure substance use disorder, deter undesirable behavior, or force LGBTQ+ individuals into heteronormativity through conversion therapy. In fact, just this year, Colorado overturned a law banning conversion therapy, making it once again legal to implement it. Little action was taken until recently toward federal regulation of these programs, like introducing the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act to the Senate in 2023 to protect the youth who find themselves inside these programs, in part because of the profit created by these institutions for the private equity firms that own them. So here's the question. If you remove the context, but keep the method, what are you left with? Because so far we've been talking about beliefs and systems that profit from them. But there's another layer to this, one that's easier to miss, but just as powerful. Cults don't just change how you think, they change how your body feels, how it reacts. And that might be one of the biggest reasons their influence works. That's where we're going next. In part 2, we'll be talking about why it's so hard to leave and what we can do to help those locked in to find a better path forward.